Evening, everyone. I'm Peter Hogan on behalf of Harbro. I would like to thank everybody for taking up their time this evening to join us on our 5th webinar called Lambing for Success. Hopefully we'll have a few more as the year goes on. We've got a tremendous selection of speakers tonight who I'll pass you on to in a minute. As per normal, we'll do a Q&A session at the end, so just put your questions in the chat box and we'll pick them up. If we're kind of limited for time, so if we're struggling to answer any, we can always pick up afterwards and get back to people. So I'll pass you on to Jill now.
Excellent, thank you, Peter. Okay, evening everybody. My name is Jill Hunter. I'm the beef and sheep nutritionist with Harbro. So some of you might have joined us for the pre-tupping webinar back in September time, when we talked about how nutrition could help us influence the genetic potential of the lambs that we were going to be producing. So now we've put the tups out. We've got through most of the winter, although it's looking pretty rough still out there this evening. We now need to, we're probably scanned, and now we need to think about how we're going to support the ewes as we come closer to lambing. To me, we can separate the pre-lambing nutrition into 4 separate sections. So we can think about supporting the ewe, that's before lambing, at the point of lambing, and then after lambing. We need to think about the get up and the go, or the vitality of those newborn lambs. We need to think very carefully about the quality of the colostrum and the subsequent milk that they get, and then the subsequent lamb growth once we've got them all out alive. So we'll start off thinking about how we support the ewe. So there's a few things that we need to consider when we're supporting the ewe. The first consideration is body condition score. We should always keep in mind that different breeds and different production systems have different targets. So this example that I've got here is the body condition score throughout the year for an upland twin breeding ewe. The drop in body condition that you see coming towards lambing happens reasonably naturally as the grass quality is deteriorated, but we really don't want it to drop any lower than a 2.5 at the point of lambing. The ideal body condition score, having an ideal body condition score at lambing, means that we've got less chance of big lambs which we can't get out, less mispresentation, less chances of metabolic diseases as well. Then we need to think about what's happening in the last 6 weeks. So in the last 6 weeks before lambing, we have to always keep in mind that 70% of the lamb growth and the fluid growth happens at that point. This results in a huge increase in nutrient demand. So her energy demand goes up, her protein demand goes up. And because of the size of the lambs, their actual physical space inside her for her rumen, for where you can fit the feed, is really restricted. So this means that anything that we give the ewe must be high energy, it must be well balanced, and it also must encourage rumen function to make sure that she's getting the most out of anything that we do feed her. And there's often a lot of talk about providing bypass protein pre-lambing, which is important for colostrum quality, but it's equally as important to feed that rumen degradable protein so we stimulate rumen function and making sure we're getting as much out of forage as possible. That's the cheapest feed. At this point, we can feed a compound feed, and a feed bucket is the most effective way to meet our needs, high energy, high protein, in a low concentration. We mustn't also forget about water requirements. So if you think about ewes which are never usually in a shed, you've taken them at the most stressful point in their year, you've put them in a shed as close to probably mixed groups, and then does you know where the water is? Can you actually reach it? Are you using cattle courts for lambing? Can they actually reach the water? And is it clean? Then we need to think about conditions, metabolic diseases, and other conditions which may affect our ewes pre-lambing. So 2 that we always get told about, our customers are always talking about, are twin lamb disease and prolapses. If we could solve this in one easy solution, that would be fine. So twin lamb disease, this is when the ewe can't meet her energy demand through her feed. She starts to mobilize body fat through her liver, and then her body becomes overwhelmed. So we can reduce the risk of twin lamb disease by making sure that we meet her energy demand by supplying forage, compound, and a feed bucket. And we have lots of discussion at Lambing Time about prolapses, and there's so many things that can increase the risk. And there's some of them that we can influence and some that we can't. But there is one in particular that we can influence by both what and how we feed them. So some of you may know or heard of John Robinson, who was at the Rowett for a long time. He's a real great believer that you should be fed at exactly the same time every day. And when I say exactly the same time every day, I mean a 15-minute window. Okay, use their brain, their clock is a 15-minute window. So what's the reason for this? This is because ewes get ready for their feed. They start to produce lots of saliva, ready for digestion, and that rumen buffering. If you're late, and probably if you're late, you might think, oh, I'm a bit late, I might feed them a little bit extra. But actually what that means is they've got little buffering capacity to deal with that feed, and they produce a little bit of extra gas because they've not been able to settle the rumen. So what that causes is a bit of extra gas, and if you think about all that lamb growth, we've got not much space, something's got to give, and most likely it's going to be our prolapse. So we know various people who do this and stick to it pretty religiously, and they absolutely swear by it. So it's not going to cost you anything. It's not something that's going to come on a lorry. Give it a go, even if it saves a few prolapses. So just control what you can, feed at the same time every day, and bearing in mind that if you're feeding more than half a kilo, which is a pound, make sure you're splitting it into 2, if not 3 feeds. Okay, so once we've successfully got the lambs out, we then need to think about supporting the ewe to make sure she repairs any damaged tissue, which has happened. She also needs to produce milk adequate enough to grow her lambs. Mastitis, we know, is a huge problem after lambing, and we know that genetics, management, hygiene and nutrition all have their role to play. So a recent HDB and Warwick study showed that 5% of ewes get acute cases of mastitis, of which about 50% of those die. 90% of what's left lose the affected side, so probably no use for next year. And above that, a further 20 to 30% suffer subclinical cases. That's a huge proportion of your flock that can be affected by mastitis. They also added to that about a quarter of cases can be put down to poor nutrition during pregnancy and lactation. So this leads to poorer immunity, which is at an already very stressful time. And poorer milk yield, meaning that lambs are constantly suckling so the udder never gets a rest, never gets a chance to repair. And with if you think about the antibiotic usage becoming more and more under pressure, it's worth reminding ourselves that one of the key focus areas for antibiotic reduction in sheep is in treating mastitis. So if we supplement ewes with compound feed after lambing, we're playing our part, we're making sure that we're boosting her immunity, and she has an ample opportunity to deal with the types of mastitis that immunity can deal with. We're never going to get rid of it, but we can play our part in that. So as a general rule, we should continue to supplement ewes until the grass sward height is just about 4 centimetres. Okay, so under 4 centimetres, the compound is complementing the grass, but once the grass is over 4 centimetres, compound feed's actually just replacing grass intake, which isn't very cost effective. One exception to this rule that I would point out is where we find the benefit of giving additional feeding to hogs, which have been lambs, so ewe hogs. We must be exceptionally good to them. They are themselves still growing, so making sure that we're looking after them to get them back in lamb again. In any case, a good target is to have all lambs weaned 100 days before you put the tup out. So think about that. Are you getting all of your ewes away from their lambs 100 days before you plan to put the tup out, in order to get them back into the body condition score that you want, and make sure that we're getting as many ewes in lamb in the next year as well. Okay, so we've looked after the ewe, we've had a seamless lambing, so that's all good. But how does what we've fed the ewe affect the get up and go of her lambs? So we all know that in the lambing field or in the shed, if we get the lambs out and alive and suckled, you're pretty much in a home run. It's so important to make it past day 1. If we make it past day 1, we've got a much better chance of survival. One key additive we use is omega-3 to increase our chances of the success. So omega-3 can come from different sources, such as fish oil or commercially produced algae. The trial I have on the screen here, great one of my favourites. This showed that adding fish oil pre-lamb into ewe diets meant the gestation was slightly longer. Okay, so lambs were just a little bit bigger. It didn't mean that they were so big that you're having to pull them out. It just meant that they're tiny little bit stronger. You know, they get out and they're fighting fit. They took less time to stand, and we know that if a lamb is quicker to stand, it's quicker to find a teat, it's quicker to suckle. And the quicker that we get the feed into it, the colostrum into it, the quicker it's getting its immunity, the quicker it's getting its energy, and we're less likely to have cases of mortality. The little graph on the right-hand side there shows you that these lambs whose ewes had been fed fish oil pre-lambing, from day 2 to day 14 were less likely to die. Okay, so the 2-week mortality rate was lowered as well. Fantastic. Okay, so if we were all in a room here together, I would ask you, would you prefer to see lambs shivering, or would you prefer to see lambs curled up and trying to keep their heat in? Okay, that's a question just for you to think about. We want to see them shivering, okay? If they're shivering, they're mobilizing the brown fat. So that brown fat is that newborn fat. If they're lying down and keeping the heat in, they're not actually keeping heat in. They aren't generating any, and they're losing it. So shivering accounts for about 50% of heat production in newborn lambs. And brown fat, which is that layer of fat the lamb's born with, accounts for a further 30%. Alongside other supplements, selenium is essential for many processes in the newborn lamb, including muscle function, which allows them to shiver and plays a key role in the enzyme which releases the energy from the brown fat. This is why we supplement ewes with selenium pre-lambing. Now, traditional sources of selenium can be poor quality and are not well utilised by the animal. And for that reason, we choose to use Celplex. It's an organic yeast-based selenium which is readily absorbed and utilised by the ewes. Trials on Celplex have shown that lambs grew quicker, they were heavier, and more lambs were weaned in comparison to where ewes hadn't been fed the Celplex pre-lambing. And we often focus on the level of vitamin E in feeds, which is right to a point. It does have its limits and has to be accompanied by the right level of selenium in the right form, preferably Celplex. So we've got the lamb out, it's trying to suckle. How do we know what it's suckling is actually any good? Now, we have all been lectured to death just about colostrum. So all I wanted to do is just give you a quick reminder of the rules when it comes to colostrum. So first of all, quickly, we've already sorted out the get up and go. We've got the Celplex, we've got the omega-3. So we just need to make sure that they're reaching the teats and suckling as soon as they can. As soon as lambs are born, their ability to get the benefit from the colostrum starts to decline because their gut wall starts to close. So get it into them as soon as possible. When it comes to quantity, it's a bit of a tricky one. You know what it's like. You've lambed them, you put them in the pen, and you're on to the next one, and you come back. How do you know how much is taken? You don't. You check that their bellies are full, and that when they stand up, they have that nice big stretch. You know that they've had their fill. If you're unsure, top it up. Don't be scared. Preferably from its mother, if not from another ewe. When it comes to quality, there's so much we can do nutritionally to influence the quality. We make sure that the right proportion of our diet pre-lambing is coming from bypass protein. Traditionally, this would have been from fish meal. More recently, this would have been from soybean meal. And as we move towards a more carbon neutral target in the industry, we have options available which have the same benefit on colostrum quality. Finally, I would really encourage everybody to get hold of one of these bits of kit on the right. A Brix refractometer is superb, so easy to use. You just get a little pipette, you put a couple of drops on that little blue tab at the end, and then you look through the end and it tells you how good your colostrum is. Top-notch bit of kit. Okay, so we've decided what it is we want to achieve and what we should include in our feed to make all of that happen. So what products? So at Harbro, we've taken account of academic work, our own research and development work, and on-farm results. Farmers know what works, and we've combined them into our ranges. The two of our real key products for commercial use are Vitality feed buckets and Premium 18 compounded feed. Energised Vitality should be used from 6 weeks pre-lambing. So for a lot of people, that's now, or maybe even last week, okay? Benefits of feeding Energised Vitality. Top one would be reducing the risk of twin lamb disease. The source of energy in that bucket is propylene glycol, and this reduces the stress in the liver because it's an instant source of energy. And we also don't add extra vegetable oil, as this would stress out the liver, and that's what we're trying to avoid in twin lamb. However, adding extra vegetable oil might be a lovely way to put a high energy value on the front of the bucket. All the other additives which we've already discussed, that we decided that that's what we want to include, so Celplex and omega-3 are included in there as well. It's also worth bearing in mind that ewes will have access to this energy-dense feed 24 hours a day, as and when they feel like they need to top themselves up with a little extra bit of energy. So it's essential, especially for ewes that are under stress, thinking about how big those lambs are going to grow inside there and how compressed that rumen is going to be. And we have a range of ewe compound feeds. The most popular is Premium U. It's a high specification feed, contains all of the features that we expect, and it's ideal for before and after lambing. Okay, so we've got live lambs, and they're all out, they're suckled, and they're out in the field. So we need to consider their growth. Now, the first step towards lamb growth is rumen development and function. So whether you're going to feed lambs compound feed or finish them off grass, feed and creep is the best way to develop the rumen, okay, to set the lambs up for the rest of their life. Now, the picture here shows you, the first picture is a rumen which has fed only milk. The middle one was fed milk and grain, so starchy cereals, and the one on the right-hand side has been fed milk and hay, okay? So milk only, milk and grain, milk and hay. So this confirms the importance of starch in the process of developing the rumen. The picture in the middle is the one we want. It's got the biggest surface area. It's going to be absorb the most amount of nutrients from either the feed that you feed the lamb or the grass that it's grazing throughout its life. So once the rumen is developed at around 12 weeks of age, if lambs are to be finished quickly, it's really important to consider a feed which is going to promote a quick, effective finish. This is the most efficient time in a lamb's life, so you have to take advantage of that. You're never going to get a better feed conversion, and the younger a ruminant is, the more efficient it's going to be. When finishing lambs, feed conversion is the most important consideration. It's the most important factor that you should be thinking about, rather than the cost per tonne of feed. A feed conversion of 4 to 1, which we expect with lamb feeder, means the lamb eats 4 kilos of feed to put on 1 kilo of live weight gain. Okay, so feeds which aren't as well balanced as lamb feeder, that aren't as energy rich and don't contain rumitech, are more likely to achieve a 5 to 1 ratio. So that's an extra kilo of feed for every kilo you want the lamb to gain. Okay, so for example, if lamb feeder is £300 a tonne, it's going to cost you £1.20 to put on a kilo of live weight gain, in comparison to £1.50 if they do a 5 to 1 feed conversion. This means that a competitor product would need to be £240 a tonne or less to be better value than lamb feeder at 300. So finally, just a quick note about rumitech, which is our unique additive. It's carbon trust approved to reduce methane emissions. It results in more eye muscle area being laid down, which increases your kill out percentage, and ultimately a better feed conversion for a more profitable system. So just to summarise, getting ewe nutrition right pre-lambing really does pay dividends for ewe health, lamb viability, survivability, and subsequent growth. Okay, so there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So I'm now going to pass over to Jessica Cooke from Volac.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Jill. I am Jessica Cooke from Volac. I am a research scientist with Volac, responsible for the young animal research and development, so feeding all the latest scientific research into our innovations process for product development, as well as using this latest data to provide the most up-to-date best practice recommendations for rearing young stock on farm. Volac have been involved in lamb nutrition for over 50 years. Throughout this time, we have continued to research formulation and processing developments to ensure that Lamlac remains the UK's #1 selling formula. This evening, I am going to present to you some of our latest trial data for rearing lambs on Lamlac, demonstrating the fast, healthy growth that can be expected from using a high-performance milk formula. So last year we carried out 2 trials. So back in February, March of 2020, we used 2 sites. Firstly, we used Harper Adams University in Newport, and our second site was a commercial unit in Lancashire. For the purpose of the trial, we were recruiting lambs from triplet-bearing ewes, and we removed the strongest, largest lamb from the ewe, leaving an equal pair of lambs on the ewe. At Site 1 at Harper Adams University, they were Suffolk Mule ewes cross a Texel tup, and for the purpose of the trial, we fed 13 lambs via a U2 milk feeder, and these lambs were weighed weekly. On Site 2, on the commercial unit, the ewes were Aberfield Mule cross ewes, and again for the trial, 100 lambs were fed on Lamlac, and then 51 of these lambs were actually weighed, and they were weighed at birth, at 2 weeks, and at weaning at 5 weeks of age. And these lambs were reared on an eco feeder. The management across both the sites was fairly similar for the lambs. So all lambs on the trial were being fed Lamlac milk replacer, which is a 24% crude protein, 24% fat product. The milk replacer was mixed at 20%, so that's 200 grams of milk powder per litre of mixed milk. Following the colostrum feeding period, the lambs were being fed restricted milk from 24 hours of age until they were trained to feed from either the eco feeder or the U2 feeder. Once they'd all learnt to suckle, they were fed milk ad libitum. On average, lambs were consuming around 12 kilos of milk powder up until weaning at 5 weeks of age. The temperature of the milk was initially started at 25 degrees C, and once all the lambs in a pen had learnt to suckle, so as soon as the youngest lamb had been put in that pen and was trained to feed from the feeder, the milk temperature was reduced down to 20 degrees C for about a week, and then it was reduced further down to 15 degrees C through to weaning. And getting a reduction in that temperature, so just cooling it slightly, is important to really sort of stimulate creep feed intake and to reduce the risk of overconsumption. All lambs were offered ad lib fresh water, creep and forage once they were in their group pens on the feeder. And all lambs across both sites were weaned abruptly at 35 days of age. But we did make sure that they weighed a minimum of 2.5 times their birth weight. And for both of these trial sites, that was they had to achieve a weaning weight of around 10 kilos to make sure they achieved that 2.5 times their birth weight. And they needed to be consuming at least 250 grams of creep feed per day. So moving on to the results, firstly, across both the sites, all lambs achieved a minimum of 10 kilos of body weight at weaning at 35 days of age. If we look in this table here, we've got the weekly body weights that were captured for the lambs. So firstly, looking at the birth weight of the lambs, they were fairly similar across both the sites. So you can see that on average, lambs weighed between 4 and 4.5 kilos, ranging between individual lambs from around 3 to 6 kilos across both the sites. On site 1, lambs had increased to 6 kilos by week 1. And by week 2, across both the sites, lambs were almost hitting 9 kilos per 9 kilos on average, ranging between individual lambs from 6 through to 13 kilos. On site 1, lambs were achieving on average 12 kilos by week 3, and this had increased to 15 kilos by week 4. At weaning, so at 35 days of age, lambs on site 1 were achieving average body weights of 18 kilos per day, ranging from 13 to 23 kilos between individual lambs. On site 2, weaning weights were on average 15 kilos, with a similar range ranging from 10 through to 22 kilos. So overall, body weights were very good at weaning at 35 days of age across both the sites. Using the body weights that were captured, we calculated the average daily live weight gain up to weaning, and focusing in first on site 1. So the mean daily live weight gain from birth through to 2 weeks of age was 0.31 kilos per day. This did increase towards the sort of second part of the milk feeding period. So from week 2 through to weaning, the daily live weight gain increased to 0.43 kilos per day. And I think that's sort of a reflection of the milk intakes increasing as those lambs got that bit bigger. So milk intakes increased to 2 litres per day at around week 3, and then they increased a little bit more to 2.5 litres per day as weaning approached, which I think is very much reflected in the higher daily live weight gain from week 2 through to weaning. But overall, from birth through to weaning, lambs on site 1 achieved daily live weight gains of 0.38 kilos per day, ranging from 0.3 to 0.5 kilos per day between individual lambs. On site 2, the daily live weight gain was more consistent throughout the entire milk feeding period up to weaning, and on average from birth through to weaning, it was 0.31 kilos per day, ranging between individual lambs from 0.2 through to 0.5 kilos per day. So just some key considerations when we are rearing lambs artificially on milk replacer. Before we can even think about offering the milk, we need to get the colostrum management right of these lambs, as we saw in Jill's presentation. And for that, we know that good colostrum intake is associated with reduced mortality and improved subsequent growth performance. So it's absolutely key that we focus on colostrum management over those first 24 hours. Between the 2 sites that we used, there was a difference in colostrum management. So at Harper Adams University, the lambs were being fed colostrum via a teatened bottle. So a known quantity of a known quality of colostrum was put into those lambs, and they were getting 3 feeds of colostrum over the first 24 hours. This was slightly different to the practice on the commercial unit. So on the commercial unit, lambs were being left with the ewe for the first 24 hours. So there was sort of no guarantee of how much colostrum and the quality that they were actually getting. It's important to consider group sizes and the number of teats per lamb, just thinking about trying to make sure you reduce the impact of any competition between those older and younger lambs within a pen. So we would recommend a maximum number of 10 lambs per teat, but actually ideally if you can keep this to 6 to 8 lambs per teat, that will be better and help to reduce the competition between some of those stronger and weaker lambs. Lambs need to be consuming at least 9 to 12 kilos of Lamlac through to weaning at 35 days of age to achieve these types of growth rates. And again, as we heard from Jill, creep feed intake is absolutely critical in terms of developing that rumen, and making sure you've got a well-developed rumen as you approach weaning is key, just to avoid any setbacks at weaning and in the early days post-weaning. Above all, attention to detail and good management is absolutely essential when rearing these lambs artificially. So why feed Lamlac? Lamlac is based on high quality dairy protein. It's rich in amino acids, which are the building blocks of growth. So it very much supports fast growth. The dairy protein used also retains those naturally occurring immunoglobulins, which very much support healthy growth. It has high energy levels, which are achieved by incorporating a proven blend of high quality vegetable oils. And we make sure that we actually provide those lambs with the right balance of short and medium chain fatty acids, which are what it uses as its energy source. In addition, the fat used, so the oil used, has a small globule size, which again aids digestibility for these young lambs. Lamlac has a fixed formulation, so it consistently provides all the nutrients required by the young lamb. So all those key vitamins such as vitamin A, E and D3 that are so playing such important roles in immune function. Lamlac provides those key nutrients that the lamb needs. And as we've seen from the trial work, it's tried and it's tested and it works on farm. So just to summarise, this recent trial data shows that lambs reared on Lamlac weighed on average between 15 to 18 kilos at weaning at 35 days of age across the 2 trial sites that we used. With lamb prices at around £90 per lamb in 2020, and accounting for milk intake, so allowing 12 kilos of milk powder per lamb through to weaning, and also accounting for the creep costs up until slaughter and vaccination and straw costs, this could yield a profit of about £40 per lamb. Furthermore, by removing the 3rd lamb and actually leaving the ewe with 2 healthy lambs, which in normal conditions should thrive when they're turned out to grass, you're actually reducing the pressure on that ewe. So you're going to hopefully just improve that flock longevity by leaving just 2 lambs on the ewe. So these latest trial results show that with good management practices, lambs can be successfully reared with Volac Lamlac, and this very much helps to maximise the number of lambs that can be reared in flocks. I look forward to answering your questions a bit later this evening, but for now I'm going to pass you over to Reg Jones from Glasgow Vet School.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for that, Jessica. That was brilliant. So I'm Reg Jones. I work at Glasgow University in the vet school. I'm one of the farm animal vets there. Also work very closely with Harbro on a range of projects, and my special interest is in beef and sheep production. So tonight I'm going to be speaking about data collection around lambing time and benchmarking lamb production. First off, we've got a quick summary of some of the principles around benchmarking. Simply, to benchmark is to compare one thing to a set standard, and what we compare is called a key performance indicator. KPIs tend to be objective things that we can count or measure, and they tend to relate to performance or finances. When starting to benchmark, the best thing is to choose a really broad KPI, which gives us a general overview of performance for that farm. In this instance, an example would be percentage of lambs lost between scanning and rearing. And this overall view would give us an idea of where to concentrate on in kind of later benchmarking exercises. KPIs can be used actively, or they can be used to kind of review production. An example of active KPIs could be body condition scoring at around scanning, and this practice enables us to make decisions on the go with regards to nutrition, whereas our percentage of lambs lost between scanning and rearing is really looking at the production from the previous year with a view to improving production in the following year. The standards to which you or we compare your KPIs against is really up to you as the farmer. You can compare within farms, so you're comparing yourself to yourself with your production from a year-to-year point of view. You can compare with local discussion groups or within a breed society group, or you can compare within industry standard and either comparing with the mean of the industry or the average farm for the industry, or the top third or the top 10%, depending on where you are. It's always really important to plan when and how and with who you're going to review your data, and maybe involve those people at the very beginning so that they can give you any tips about what actual data to collect initially. So, why record data at lambing? We're all very busy, we're all very tired, and it's slightly demoralizing when we're actually counting dead lambs going into a bag. Lamb losses from scanning to rearing account for the majority of lost potential earnings for any sheep business. So it is quite important that we start looking at that. These losses of up to 20% of lambs scanned can be quite high, although industry targets tend to be around 13 to 14% losses of lambs scanned. But even at 13%, when you think of it, if you have a 500 ewe flock scanning at 200%, that's still 130 lambs, which is quite a few animals. As you can see from the pie chart here, data from AHGB suggests that only 10% of lamb losses occur 2 weeks after lambing, so between the 2 weeks after lambing and when we sell or have decided to retain those lambs. So 90% of our lamb losses occur between scanning and 2 weeks after lambing, with 50% of our lamb losses occurring in the first 48 hours post-birth. So recording is really important to distinguish the where, the when, and to a degree the why lambs have been lost. And in turn, we can then prioritise our resources, our time and money into reducing these losses in coming years. So, as discussed a few slides ago, we should really begin with a broad stroke, often using figures that we've already collected passively. Things like lamb scanning percentage, which a lot of us already do. This can be our starting figure. And we can compare that in the broadest sense to animals that we've sold, and just really simply compare the animals that we should have had and the animals that we ended up getting something in return for. We can then narrow this down by looking at other figures that we passively collect. So number of lambs at weaning, number of lambs at vaccination points, and some people will be recording number of lambs turned out of a shed or the number of lambs turned onto a moor. It becomes slightly more difficult as we constrict and kind of really concentrate on the time periods that we want to be interested in. This is especially so in the first 2 weeks post-lambing. Nothing there is passively captured, so we have to make an extra effort to capture this data. And this data can be, should be captured in very detailed amounts. So we would need to be looking at things like number of stillbirths, a number of lambs died in 48 hours from birth, and possibly comparing them to, twins to triplets, ewe lambs to adult ewes, and even recording individual diseases like watery mouth or scour, or even if a ewe's blade on a lamb. Now, this is incredibly difficult at lambing. We're all very busy, and there are multiple ways of recording this data. And especially initially, I would always suggest that we do not concentrate on these minutiae. I would really go broad. Some examples of what I've seen work very well on farms are the wheelie bin strategy, where farmers have 3 wheelie bins outside the lambing shed, one for lambs picked up from the outside, one for wet lambs picked up in the shed, so stillborn lambs, and one for dry lambs picked up in the shed, so lambs that weren't stillborn but have subsequently died before being turned out. And every time a lamb was put into one of these wheelie bins, the farmer would mark it, tally up on the side of the wheeling bin with a permanent marker, and just count them at the end of lambing. Worked very well, because it only needs a wipe with some spirit to wash the tally marks away at the end of lambing. Other farmers like a spreadsheet kind of scenario where they have a piece of paper in the lambing shed and they record everything down, while others use pen and paper. But really, it's whatever works for you. The important thing is that we do not forget the ewes as well. Although we're talking about recording lamb data here, we need to be aware that things that happen in the ewes will result in possibly more lambs lost. So it's really important to record diseases and mortality in the ewes in parallel to mortality in the lambs. So what can we do with the results? Well, first off, they work in a really good way to provide an early detection system, especially if we've been doing this for a couple of years. For instance, if we're recording stillbirths and in the first 2 weeks of lambing that we've noticed that we've had more stillbirths than the entirety of lambing the previous year, then that's a really big red flag for us to start looking and seeing why this is happening. As we discussed previously, it allows us to benchmark it ourselves to our peers, and we can see if we're performing worse, and if so, we can possibly look at and see why. We can see if we're performing better, and if we are performing better, it provides us an opportunity then to maybe share this trade secret with the rest of the industry. The table on the slide on the screen here lists some industry targets. These targets are quite steep, however, they are achievable. And I have seen farms that have managed to have lamb losses from scanning to rearing of under 10%. I think one of the most important things that benchmarking in this way does is it forces us to critically evaluate what we do and why we're doing it on farm. We all improve our practice on a daily basis and we're getting better at what we do. And some of the things that we used to do may not be as useful as they were previously. So this will let us review our current practices. And finally, it prompts us to investigate any abnormal results, as with all good benchmarking and data collection. The example at the bottom there just really highlights how complicated it is when we're looking at the minutiae of lamb losses around the first 2 weeks of lambing. So, in summary, the majority of lambs are lost at lambing. Recording when and how lambs are lost enables us to target our resources into investigating why these lambs have been lost, and it enables some cost-effective interventions. Continued benchmarking allows us to assess if these interventions have been successful, and if they're not, then we can change them. And remember, don't start at the very, very top. Broad strokes to begin with, and then carry on from there. So I'm going to pass now to Ali Anderson from Zoetis, and she'll give a final talk for this evening.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I think there was a slight technical hitch. I hope you can see my slides okay. And yes, as I was about to say, I just wanted to talk about worming ewes around lambing time. And so looking at this first slide here, this just shows us the year And I just want to take a look at the red line here, which is the ewe fecal egg output. So the spring rise is also known as the periparturient rise, and this is the name that's given to the increase in egg output that we can see here that happens to ewes around lambing time. And this is due to the change in the immune status that the ewes get around lambing. For the majority of the year, they've built up immunity against the worms. They're not producing a huge number of eggs. But then as we get to lambing time, they're obviously under a lot of pressure. They're growing the lambs, they're producing colostrum, they've got to produce the milk as well. And so what this means is that these worms are able to produce more eggs than usual. And we see an increase in the egg output. And what this then means is we have an increased amount of contamination on the pasture. And all of this isn't too much of an issue for the worms. As I said, the ewes are pretty good at controlling the worms. But what it can mean is the knock-on impact this can have on lambs later on in the season. So as we can see here, this red dotted line represents the lamb fecal egg output. So because of the contamination laid down by the ewes, we then get an increase in worm eggs in the lambs. The lambs have never experienced the worms before. They haven't got immunity. So when they first meet these worms and pick up the larvae, they then turn into adults and produce a huge number of worm eggs from the lambs. And this then leads on to the big purple peak we can see here, which is the larval contamination on pasture. So a lot of this is occurring because of the knock-on effect we see from the eggs that the ewes have produced around lambing time. Now, I just want to say, I obviously don't have too long to talk tonight, but nutrition plays a really important role in this. We've been speaking about this earlier, but ewes that are in a very good condition, have good body condition score, are getting the right level of feeding, are able to control this spring rise themselves. So when we're talking about treating ewes at lambing time, we don't want to be treating all of the ewes. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to look at which ewes that we need to think about treating. So as I say, one really good measure and thing to look at is body condition score. The other thing that can be looked at is how many lambs that ewe is carrying. So as we can see from the graphic here, this was some trial work that we ran a few years ago. And this was looking at what was the worm egg output for ewes that were carrying either single lambs, twin lambs, or triplets. And what this tells us is, as you would suspect, so none of these ewes have been treated, but the ewes that were carrying the triplets were under more pressure, were producing more worm eggs compared to the twin-bearing ewes and the single-bearing ewes. So that means that when we're thinking about treatment, the single-bearing ewes that are in good condition, we could assume that they are unlikely to producing huge numbers of eggs and therefore leave them untreated. Whereas a triplet-bearing ewes are under more pressure, it's highly likely that they will be producing worm eggs and contaminating the pasture. So again, best method we can do is to do some fecal egg counting and just confirm that. But just as a guide, that's a really good starting point. So on to this next slide, what we're looking at here is from another study we did, and this was looking at twin-bearing ewes. And what we wanted to see was what happened if we used a long-acting treatment versus a short, non-persistent treatment, so a short-acting treatment. And here we were just using twin-bearing ewes, split into 3 groups. There was the control group, and this graph is showing us the worm egg output from the ewes. So the pink here is the control group. So we can see from around lambing time, we see this increase in fecal egg output. And again, during lactation as well, quite a high amount of worm egg count seen there. When a non-persistent treatment was used, what happened was the initial sort of bump and increase in worm egg count was gone. That was taken out by the short-acting treatment. But however, 3 weeks later, these ewes started producing worm eggs again. So we can see again more pasture contamination. And then with the long-acting treatment, this covered the area for the whole of the spring rise. And what we could see is that the fecal egg count remained low throughout. And then this study also followed on to look at the fecal egg counts in the lambs. And what we found was for the long-acting treatment group, that lamb egg count remained low up to 8 or 9 weeks when they were 8 or 9 weeks old, which was when the data was taken. And what that then meant was there was no need to treat the lambs for strong gall eggs. At that point, we could just continue to monitor the lambs throughout the season. I know, monitoring fecal egg counts, monitoring growth rates, and then only treat for stomach worms when necessary. One thing just to point out is we do need to consider nematodirus in all of this, because the ewes aren't involved in the nematodirus life cycle. That is based on pasture grazing from the lambs the year before. So it is important to keep an eye on things like the nematodirus forecast, and just bear that in mind that lambs may need treatment for that. Just briefly wanted to show you some data from our parasite watch scheme. This is data taken from 26 farms across the UK, and this data is from the last 5 years. Just wanted to highlight 2020, while it's still relatively fresh in the mind. And this is the worm egg counts. We can see the strong gall eggs. And what we see here is when the weather was warm and dry in April, May last year, we did see a bit of a drop in worm egg counts. But then as the weather, as it does, we had a bit of a wet few months in July and August. That's when we saw this increase in the worm egg count here. And then again, going into the autumn time, because it was relatively warm and wet, we continued to monitor, and you can see the actual highest egg counts that we got last year were in October, November time. So I think it's really important for whatever treatments you're planning for your lambs this summer. Monitoring is really important, because it really does depend on what the weather's doing, pasture management, that kind of thing as well. So we can't just treat the same every year. We do need to just look at these patterns and do some monitoring and treat off the back of that. So I mentioned the long-acting treatment when we were talking about worming the ewes, and CYDECTIN 2% was the treatment that was used in that. This is a long-acting moxidectin product, which is one of the group 3 or clear wormers. Has a persistency up to 111 days for Homuncus, and is longer-acting against other worms as well. And again, proven to control the spring rise. One thing to note, CYDECTIN long-acting can also be used to treat scab. When we're treating ewes at lambing time, it's really important that we leave some of these ewes untreated. This is because it's a high risk of developing anthelmintic resistance at that point, so we do want to leave some ewes untreated. Just to note, if you're treating for sheep scab, it's really important that all the sheep are treated as well. So when we're using this product, we just need to think, what are our aims, what are we using it for, and make sure that we're using it appropriately. And just the point on administration, this is licensed to be used subcutaneously and high up on at the neck, as you can see from the picture here. Use it at the base of the ear, and do make sure you're using an appropriate applicator, because it's an oil-based formulation, so that can have an impact on some of the applicators that are used. And finally, just wanted to highlight some points about worm resistance. As we know, this is a big problem in the UK. This data is taken from a project done in Wales in 2015. And I think it's really good to see this data, and it shows us a bit of a snapshot of what was happening on those farms at that time. I think ideally, if you can work with your animal health providers, do some drench checking, build a picture of what's happening on your farms. This will really help going into the future, because we do have a limited number of options available, a limited number of groups of wormers, and we do need to make sure we're using these effectively at the moment, and make sure we're doing what we can to make sure we can keep using them going into the future as well. And on the back of that, we did some work with SCOPs over the last year or so. And this was just around the responsible use of CYDECTIN and how it can be used on farms so that it is effective, does the job, and can continue to do the job for years to come. So these are just some guidelines. And again, there's a lot more information on this on the SCOPS website as well. But again, just a few points to highlight is that the year-on-year use of moxidectin around lambing is unadvisable. And as I say, the big point, when ewes are treated with moxidectin at that time, it really is important to leave some untreated. Aim for at least 10% left untreated, but again, if nutrition is good and that side of things, then we can leave more untreated. And again, moxidectin 2% shouldn't be used more than once in any flock in 1 year. So this comes back to the point I was saying about the fact it can be used for scab treatment as well. But if we've used moxidectin to suppress a spring rise, and then you're unfortunate enough to have a scab outbreak later on in the year, that's where we would be recommend that using a dip would be a good idea at that point as well. But again, do seek advice on all of these things from whoever you're getting your medicines prescribed from as well. And then finally, for me, this is the big one, is checking dose rates, administration methods, of animals being weighed. Are they getting the right amount of the drug that they should be getting in order for it to work? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ollie, Reg, Jessica and Jill. That was all excellent. I was just going to say that you'll actually get a link sent through for a recording of the webinar for the people that have come on, so you can always forward it on or just send it, other people can see it as well. I'm conscious of the time, so we'll kind of do a 10-15 minutes of questions. I was just thinking myself, I didn't realise that Zoetis was owned by Pfizer, so I thought possibly maybe if we give everybody a wee shot of Dectomax, it would speed the job up, but maybe not. Anyway, the first question we'll start with is for Jill. Do you have a guide of feeding rates for pre-lambing, of an 18% compound for ewes, body condition score 2.5 to 3? Yeah.
Good question. When it comes to feeding rates, is so difficult when you've not seen the ewes. But as a general guide, if they're 2.5 to 3, they're carrying twins, they're sort of commercial type ewes, the likelihood is they'll need about 0.5 kilo, and then up at the point of lambing, raising them to about 1 kilo. Depending on what other forage and things is available, if somebody wants to talk about it in more detail, get in touch with one of us and we can talk through it in more detail. But that would be a rough guide. Start them off with just a small quantity and build them up.
Excellent. Next one's for Reg. You spoke about dead lambs. How can you tell how they died? Because usually you just pick them up and that's it.
Oh, that's quite a good question. So what I would suggest is that there are a lot of vets that will provide post-mortem services at the practice. We could always send them to the college or the APHA, depending if you're in England. And also a lot of veterinary practices now do offer some lamb post-mortem training to farmers. And that's the best way of doing it, bearing in mind that we could always get it wrong. And retraining is always important. And that is probably more cost effective for farms that are over your 200 or 300 ewe mark to get this training done. For farms with fewer ewes, probably best just to stick to the vet, because you won't be seeing enough dead lambs to get really good at it.
Good. The next one is for Dr. Jessica. Does Lamlac make a powdered milk with ewes milk to hopefully reduce bloat?
No, we don't make a milk replacer based on ewe's milk. All of our milk replacers, both the calf and the lamb, are based on a concentrated whey protein phospholipid base. But I think in terms specifically related to bloat, it's an interesting question. It'd be useful to know a little bit more about the system, what system is being used, and what age the lambs are when they're experiencing cases of bloat. Because I think from sort of experience, feeding practices can often go a long way to actually help reduce the incidence of bloat. Things like making sure that the milk's not too warm, and not once those lambs have been trained onto a feeder, get that milk temperature down to try and avoid overconsumption. Consistency is really important, so mix at the same mixing rate, concentration as recommended on the bags, and always stick to that. And if you're bottle feeding, feed those lambs at the same time each day. And then there's also management factors in terms of just making sure that you're not using worn teats, check that they're in good conditions, you haven't got huge holes that the milk's pouring out of. And then I think the final thing is just to make sure that lambs aren't kept on milk for too long. So, you know, get them weaned as soon as they're sort of 2.5 times their birth weight, and get them off the milk so you're in a bit safer ground to avoid sort of the risk of bloat. Abruptly weaning is always sort of the best way to do it. Just wean them abruptly as long as they're eating enough creep. That seems to be the best way to do it.
Excellent. Yeah, there's a lot of good relevant questions that are when worming, for you, Ali, sorry, when worming ewes pre-lambing, can we vaccinate at the same time?
Yeah, it's a slightly difficult question to answer. When all these products are licensed, they're usually just tested by being used on their own, and therefore there's very little data around what happens when you use a product at the time and that kind of thing. My advice would be speak to whoever you're getting your medicine from, check with them, they may have some information on it, and it really should just be done on a sort of case-by-case basis rather than me. Obviously, I don't know what sort of vaccines will be being used at this point, but it's definitely worth seeking advice and asking the question, because obviously the benefits, if these are products that can be used together and someone has some data on them, I can appreciate that there is a good time benefit at that point. So yeah, seek advice on a case-by-case basis.
And also, how would you decide which sheep should be left untreated with moxidectin?
Yeah, I think this is again something that is not really straightforward. I wish there was a really easy answer. What we can do is use the different kind of monitoring methods. So body condition score is a really good one to go off. If you've got animals in good body condition score, then they're not as likely to be affected by the spring rise. So if you're confident doing that, that's one. Fecal egg counting is the other one, which is really beneficial as well, because that will give us an idea of you know, if you group up ewes and then take samples from them, and hopefully that will give some idea as well. But I think what we saw from some of the graphs I showed, not always that easy to predict, because some ewes will have higher egg count at the point of lambing, and others might have a higher egg count later on in lactation. We do just need to watch the ewes across that whole time period as well. But certainly as a sort of base level, body condition score and number of lambs they're carrying as well will be a really good starting point.
Good. Next one's for Jill. Can ad-lib access to the Energized Vitality increase the odds of pre-lambing prolapse, especially in a small flock?
Okay. Vitality, access to vitality shouldn't. There's no real logical reason why that would cause prolapses. They'll take, because they've got ad-lib access to it, they'll take little and often, as long as there's sort of 25 to 30 ewes, no more than that to a bucket. They'll take little and often, which means that their rumen pH should be reasonably stable, so you're not getting big spikes where they might be building up that gas, which we were talking about earlier, causes the prolapse to come out. Other things that might be causing a high rate of prolapses could be genetics, it could be body condition as well. So just thinking about what condition that they're in and what we're feeding them. Are we feeding at the same time every day as well? That would help. But ad-lib access to vitality shouldn't cause prolapses, no.
And when you're there, Jill, cell plates, you mentioned for selenium deficiency. How is this administered? You can see on the web that Alltech don't mention sheep. Keen on this, because we know who are deficient in selenium.
Okay, so Alltech have done a good bit of work with selenium in sheep, and if we'll have contact details there, I can share that with you, absolutely. We've also done a lot of work with Cellplex ourselves in sheep. How is it administered? It's in the feed, so Cellplex is used as a proportion of the selenium supplementation in either the Energized Vitality buckets or in compounded feed. And it's in a range of Harbro feeds as well. It's not just specific to ewes, it's in calf feeds, it's in pedigree feeds as well, right across the board.
Grand. For Reg, where can you find benchmarks to compare our production with?
So I initially go to any kind of people that you use for advice. So that can be a vet, nutritionist, consultant. But if you're looking online, then things like the HDB website, where you can look at beef and lamb stock take, or their better return programs that have a lot of targets in them. And if you're looking for something specifically for Scotland, then it's the Cattle and Sheep Enterprise Profitability in Scotland report from QMS, and they publish that every year. And they will benchmark several different types of farms, be it hill sheep farm, upland farms, or lowland farms, if you really want to specifically look at other farms.
Good. Jessica, somebody was wondering, how do you stop lambs from chewing teats? Is there a way?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that question and put it to someone else. I think, I mean, one of the things I would recommend, I don't know whether anybody else has any advice, but just to make sure that you've got enough teats available so, you know, the lambs can actually satisfy themselves on the milk. And then sort of, and also knowing sort of work with calves, you know, making sure that they have got sort of forage available so they can go and nibble on that and try and take the sort of the mind off chewing the teats. But I'm happy if anybody else wants to contribute to that one.
Yeah, I would actually. We have at home an automatic lamb feeder, and one of the best things that we found, and we saw it on one of these TV programs before, is actually to put a bit of a casing sort of tubing round the teat. So in actual fact, the lamb can only get its mouth in enough to suckle and not actually to bite. I have pictures and things that I can send to whoever's asked that question. Explain it, because it is the most frustrating thing. You go in the morning, the lambs have chewed the teats and the milk's everywhere. Been there, feel your pain. Yeah.
I've got one for Ali. When should the lambs receive their first worming dose, and which type should it be?
Thank you. Yeah, this is an interesting one. I think the first dose is usually we'd need to be thinking about nematovirus. As for timing, it's really going to depend on where you are in the country, what the weather's doing. The nematovirus forecast that Scott do is a really good tool. And also on our parasite website, we also do have some nematovirus lists as well. So that's a really good starting point. On the flip side to that, some of our data from parasite watch is the time of years where we're often thinking that nematovirus is the only thing to be a problem. We've had some really high stomach ache counts as well. So whereas a lot of people would maybe use a white drench for nematovirus that might have resistance issues in other worm species with that, if you use just the white drench, it can be problematic. So, best thing to do would be fecal egg counting. If we can get sort of every couple of weeks, get fecal egg counting going, that's obviously a really good way of seeing what's happening in the lambs on farm and picking out when lambs need treating. And again, as for choice of dose, it's really going to depend on farm history, what farm. And again, I'm hoping that you'll have someone, a local advisor who knows your farm, knows your flock, and make those kind of decisions with you.
Excellent. Just when you're on, Ali, one of the questions is worth worming the ewes if they're being housed for more than 6 weeks?
Yes, so I guess with the worming, it's going to be relative to when they're being turned out, because that's when the lambs are going to be at risk. So the ewes themselves shouldn't need worming just for the sake of worming the ewes. What the issue that we have is that a lot of the worms that can cause the spring rise are actually already in the ewes and they are in an arrested state. So when it comes to if they've been housed, a few weeks before lambing, they could still be carrying worms that then start producing worm eggs around lambing time. What's then important is where those eggs go. And if they're in the shed and the lambs aren't likely to be picking them up, then that's not too much of an issue. But when they're then turned out, where are they going? And what kind of pasture contamination level will that be? So that's what we'd need to consider before turnout, what wormers should be used. And again, how long you need cover for those ewes as well would be the important thing.
Good. I'm conscious of time, so we'll just do a couple more. Jessica, how would you best manage the milk temperature when you've got such a wide range of ages of pet lambs and a pen?
Yes, that's I think always a challenging one, and the temperatures that I recommended in my presentation are sort of when you have got quite a tight age range in terms of those lambs entering the pen. You know, the ideal would be to sort of start at 25, and then once you've got everything trained and all the lambs have learnt to suckle, then to gradually reduce it. But of course, you know, accounting for if you have got a wide range in and sort of a big range in lambing dates and a range of lambs entering those pens, then I think a safe bet is to sort of aim for something around 20 degrees C, just so that that's a good temperature for those older lambs and going to reduce overconsumption for them, but also it's still warm enough for those younger lambs that have only just sort of coming into the pen. So I think if you have got a big age range, then aiming for something around 20 degrees C would always be sort of recommended.
Good. Okay, we'll do two more. I've got a question here. Somebody is struggling to get lambs onto hard feed at a young age. They've tried the molasses feed and mixed and pellets. Is there anything that you would suggest, Jill, to get them going?
So if this was on Pevy, it's maybe a bit of a question for Jessica as well, just about milk concentration and temperature as well, to try and entice them onto hard feed. But I would say, Joe, that they'll come onto it when they're ready. Be careful of using a feed that's got too much molasses on it as well, because if they start to take too much of it, they might end up with a slightly upset stomach. Making sure that there's water available and forage, preferably straw, nice sharp wheat, clean wheat straw would be ideal instead of hay. Don't feed pet lambs hay, and that should help to just settle their ruminant and get it going, and they'll just pick away at that and it'll encourage them. I don't know, Jessica, have you had anything to add about milk concentration? Or?
No, I mean, I wouldn't ever touch the milk concentration. That would always need to just be as the sort of recommendation on the bag, and to stick at that and not to touch it. I mean, I think the best thing is just to try and reduce that temperature, and that's what we did in these trials, to actually get it down closer to sort of 15 to 18 degrees C. Just reducing that milk temperature should encourage creep intake, but that'll be when the lambs are just that bit older, so I don't sort of have any further recommendations of how to get them onto it in the first place.
Excellent, thanks. Final question, we'll choose we're speaking about soya as a bypass protein, and other companies do as well, but is there other feeds that contain bypass protein as well, Jill?
Yeah, there's a huge range of feeds that contain bypass protein, and feeds that are really good quality, have high levels of energy and protein in them as well. So things like distillers dark grains, perfect, really good quality feed, and bypass rape and things that we would use as pretty standard when we're trying to move away from unsustainable soya, trying to get diets that are performing perfectly as well. I guess the point is that ewes don't have a requirement for they don't have a requirement for soya. They have a requirement for bypass protein, for amino acids, the actual nutrients. So as long as we're taking them from a good quality source, it doesn't have to be soya. In the same way, soya originally started to come more into sheep feed because fish meal was taken off the market. Fish meal would be the ideal thing. We can't use it, so we moved to soya, and we want to probably move away from soya if we can. And there's perfectly good feeds in order for us to do that.
Excellent. I'd like to thank all the speakers for coming on tonight, and everybody else that came to join our webinar, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Take care.